Thing number three, moving forward, talking all of our best friend, Jerome Powell. Jerome Powell testifies on Capitol Hill, Gary.
Yeah, Rob, I don't know what's going on here. I've been so critical of the Federal Reserve for years. I've been critical of Chairman Powell. And here we are. This is like the third or fourth week in a row that I've defended him.
Yeah, we are.
Not
I
doing
I I think he maybe he's got your ear, and I don't know. I think you guys may be talking behind the scenes. You guys seem to be quite aligned.
I don't know. I don't all I can say is he hasn't paid me. He's not even a deep knowledge investing subscriber, but he should
Yeah,
be.
that's true. I can confirm that.
I know this is terrible. Anyway, Chairman Powell went to present before Congress and the Senate, as he does a couple of times a year. And he presented the Fed's semiannual monetary policy report. It's usually a chance for the chairman to present his view on what's going on, and then for lots of Congress people and senators to grandstand and scream about their own political priorities. It's generally not so conducive to good discussion. That said, one of the things we've talked about a lot here at Deep Knowledge Investing is the quiet war between the Federal Reserve on one hand, which is trying to reduce inflation and cool the economy by raising interest rates, and Congress and the White House and the Treasury on the other hand, who are spraying enormous amounts of overspending and stimulus into the economy, basically undoing everything that Powell's trying to do. And Powell's in a really delicate situation. And the reason for that is because all he has control over is the Fed funds rate. He doesn't have control over congressional spending. And again, he wants the appearance of being nonpartisan, being non-political. Now, in this case, as we've said many times, governmental overspending is a bipartisan problem. Both parties spend way too much. We're not taking a, red versus blue side on that. But I thought Powell handled himself really well. And when he was in front of Congress, he put the blame where it belonged. He talked about that the path that we're on in terms of spending being unsustainable. He's right about that. There is no way to get inflation under control when Congress is stimulating the economy, especially in relative peacetime, by trillions of dollars a year. And he gave a warning to all the people who were basically saying, hey, we should get rate cuts in July. And if not July, September. He said, look, we have a strong labor market. We have a strong overall economy. And he just flat out said, this gives us time to think and act in a considered, slow, measured way. We don't have to do emergency rate cuts here. And so, what I've said all along is that, eventually the Fed will cut, but it's not going to come anytime soon. The thing that would make me wrong is if the economy really does fall off a cliff in the next 6 weeks or so, then we'd see a September rate cut. Anything with the labor market the way it is now, the economy, the official numbers, not the real economy, the official numbers, the way they are now, and Congress spending like this, I think he holds firm. And I think he gave Congress a warning, which, Elizabeth Warren didn't like. And, watching the two of them go at it was both horrifying and funny. Mark, I know you saw that clip.
Yeah. Oh, I did. So when you put it into perspective on the deficit, Biden 21 till now is at 7.5, minus 7.5%. So when you think about it, World War II was 12.2, World War I is 4.8. So we've been at a deficit spending aggressively. And one of the things that I think people don't appreciate, and again, not that you're going to, because this is something where you have to get into the weeds, is there's still a supply demand number. And when you have Yellen saying that we're going to print money blindly because we're just going to issue debt, he's looking at this and saying, okay, well, who's the buyer? Like, who's the buyer of last resort? So sure, you're going to issue, let's just say, $1 billion of 30-year note paper. So you're going to do $1 billion of that, but then that's just because you're rolling what just expired. So what expired was $1 billion. So you have to put $1 billion back out there. But then there's the interest on that you have to include to it. Oh, and by the way, we're still spending extra money. So you have to put more money on top of it. So $1 billion is maturing and you're issuing 1.5. So you're continuously increasing the amount of paper. So when you look at the world at large, we're clear over now 300 trillion in what's out there and growing. So who is the buyer? So then it comes down to the indirect buyer. The indirect buyer is just, for layman's terms, it's just the foreign buyer of US paper. When you look at that number, it keeps going down because, well, at what point is there the clearing price? And the clearing price is always going to be so important because the government's going to want a low interest rate, but where are you going to take the risk? So that's when you start to see that movement higher. The 30-year that just came out, the 30-year auction was a very weak auction, which means that the interest rate was much higher than what was expected because people are demanding more higher risk premium, and that continues to move. So Powell is looking to say, guys, you want me to cut rates, I'm going to lose control of yield. And that's what you saw happen in the late 70s, which Volcker had to get in front of to get control of rates. Once you start entering that spiral, you then spiral out of control, and you need a massive, earth moving type, mountain moving type situation to cool things off. And that's what he's trying to avoid. So how do you do that? Higher for longer. I'm going to stay here until you become a better actor or a better manager of your finances.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating that Congress keeps screaming for Powell to lower rates. And he's basically telling them these treasury auctions are not going well. You guys need to cut spending. And their view is no, just lower rates. And the reason for that is because the vast majority of Congress is economically and financially illiterate. And the other part of it is they don't care. They want to finance our debt using inflation instead of through taxes and a real discussion about the proper rate of spending, the proper levels of spending, because they can blame inflation on everybody else. And then, they can blame inflation on corporate greed, Vladimir Putin, the boogeyman, everybody but themselves, right? And so, I think the point that you're making on Treasury Secretary Yellen is a great one. It's one we've talked about here as well. So for people who are, coming in a little bit late, what Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen is doing is she's shortening the duration of our bond portfolio. And that's just a fancy way of saying, maybe we have 10-year debt that matures and needs to be refinanced. And instead of refinancing that with 10-year debt, maybe she's refinancing that with 1-year debt. Or maybe we have 2-year debt that's maturing and she's refinancing that with 6-month debt. And that's fine. But the problem with it is it means that you have to refinance that debt more often, and it increases the size of the treasury auctions. And so, as Mark pointed out, it's a supply and demand issue. What Yellen is doing is vastly increasing the supply in each one of these auctions. And we've seen very, very large tails on these auctions. That's just a finance way of saying exactly what Mark said, which is less demand than hoped for, meaning a higher yield. So the prices come down and it's costing the government more to fund itself. And one of the places I got into a mini discussion, not a bad debate, but a little bit of a discussion on Twitter or X over the weekend, where somebody was tweeting at me or posting at me saying, Powell should lower rates. If he does, it will save the government money on interest expense. And look, I understand why this person thinks that. But I think what they don't get is Powell doesn't have control over the entire yield curve. He sets the Fed funds rate. That is the overnight lending rate. That's just the overnight rate. The 6-month, the 1-year, the 2-year, the 10-year, the 30-year treasury bonds, those are set by the market. They don't have to follow, the reference rate by the Federal Reserve. And in fact, frequently they don't. If any of you have heard talk in the last year about an inverted yield curve, what that means is that it's a simple way of saying that bond prices are not as we would expect them to be. So, the bond market doesn't always agree that they want to get in line with what the Fed is doing. Powell doesn't have control over all of that. But what Yellen is doing is actively making it more expensive for the U.S. to borrow.
Mark, anything else to add there?
Yeah, I absolutely. So when you look at what's happening, there is this that supply demand. Like when you're looking at, not only is it an issue of the supply demand that the new supply were coming out, but also to Gary's point, people also have to adjust what their portfolios look like. So when you look at Japan, when you look at those foreign buyers, they may start being net sellers. Now, all of a sudden, they need to pull dollars forward, and they're now increasing the supply even further. So you have this shift in terms of not only new supply, but also old supply that can come back to market as people are trying to manage, to Gary's point, that duration risk, because they want to make sure that they're balanced. We've seen what happens with small banks and medium-sized banks, and I think that's that risk that continues to permeate throughout the U.S. economy is how safe are banks? How safe is their duration risk? What does their hedging look like? Because you're continuing to see asset prices come down. And as those asset prices come down, all of a sudden that bond portfolio is very risky. And how do you do that? Well, you have to liquidate. If you liquidate, what's more right now, still more liquid than anything else, your treasuries. So all of a sudden you see these big flexes back and forth, and the Fed is sitting here saying, guys, like, we need to rein this in. Like, we need to slow this down. We're not, I mean, he's not sitting there calling for austerity, but which I think most people would agree we need at this point. But how do we slow the tide to try to adjust this, to make sure that we can get our feet underneath us prior to a much bigger issue that could come?
Maybe we can all say it together: higher for longer at DKI and ongoing.